Australia, the Antipodes, the Gothic dungeon at the bottom of the world, a land of reversals where swans are black instead of white, where colonisers bought their own dark subconscious and had it realised huge and grotesque on the landscape. This series will examine colonial and post-colonial history to understand where we've come from and how this shapes who we are today. How did we get from there to here? And after such bloody beginnings, what spectres still haunt the Australian subconscious? Who are the ghosts of the Australian psyche? Episode 1, The Rocks Push. Early in Australia's history, immigrants, former convicts and First Nations people who made up the lower classes of the population were pushed to the fringes of the nation's developing towns and cities. One such Sydney-side fringe was known as the Rocks, and the gang which roamed its streets was known as the Rocks Push. While the area began as an early and neat settlement, it descended into a shanty-like wattle and daub slum over the course of several decades. Earlier homes and larger structures were built from the plentiful and local sandstone rock inspiring the area's moniker. Smallpox, scarlet fever, and later the bubonic plague marred the already miserable lives of those who called the slums their home. The shamble of waterside shanties and buildings of the Rocks operated as a port district for an isolated and remote nation reliant on the importation of goods for survival. The terrain was rugged and hilly, and the dwellings had been built with little consideration to neatness or order. The district met the sea on three sides and bustled with the sounds and sights of industry. While the early days in the Rocks were more prestigious, it slipped into impoverished conditions following an increase in immigrant populations, including Irish and Chinese people who came to the wharfside for work. Although there was a growing immigrant population, many of the children of the Rocks were the direct descendants of Australia's early convicts and poorer settlers. These children could be seen begging, prostituting, stealing, and collecting food scraps to survive their harsh reality. On any given night in the Rocks, one might see pubs overflowing with drunken sailors, sex workers plying their trades in the alley, police patrolling threateningly through the streets, and flea-ridden rats scampering from moored ships. The sweet and cloying aroma of burning opium filled the streets as it wafted from the Chinese dens and gambling halls, only overpowered by the rancid smell of rotting sewerage that flowed from the gutters and into the waterways. One evening in the Rocks, a strange new odour began pouring from the chimney of Cadman's cottage, the home of a Mr. Thomas Warne. Warne was known to be surly and unpleasant, and he lived alone with only his French valet, Mr. Jean Vidal, for company. On the same day that foul-smelling smoke from Warne's chimney circled its way down to the streets below, his dishevelled valet delivered a large and mysterious package to a local boatman with an odd request to dispose of it into the harbour. The boatman's suspicions were piqued, and when he inspected the bundle, he was horrified to find the bloody torso of a man. The valet soon admitted to having murdered Mr. Warne after a minor quarrel. To cover up his crime, he removed Warne's arms, legs and head and cut them into pieces before burning them in the fireplace and depositing the torso into the custody of his chosen boatman. A publication in The Australian told of Vidal's hanging execution, and it read, "The fatal sign was given, the bolt withdrawn, and the miserable criminal launched into eternity." The body continued to struggle convulsively for a minute or two. After that, occasional spasmodic movements showed that life was slowly extinguished. Dark tales, such as the gruesome murder of Mr. Warne, swirled about the alleys of the Rocks and lent credence to the fears held by those of higher social classes who dared not visit the slum or its bawdy establishments. Soon it was rumoured that an increasingly organised contingency was perpetrating much of the violence throughout Sydney's outskirts. The Rocks Push were alleged to be the cause of the blood spilled nightly on the streets of the Rocks, where brawls, slashings, organised bouts, cockfighting and dogfighting predominated. A main thoroughfare of the area was nicknamed the Suez Canal, which played on both its Egyptian namesake and its closeness to the word sewer. This was an area of many terrible tales. Women were warned of being kidnapped by brothel owners and being drugged and raped in opium dens. The area was seemingly overrun with what the papers and politicians were calling the larrikin push. The term larrikin was popular derogatory slang used to describe a young person who was rowdy, mischievous, and above all, lower class. Larrikinism was not just associated with men. Women were also tarred with the larrikin brush for behaviours which were deemed to be vulgar and unfeminine. Larrikinism, at the time, lacked its more contemporary and romanticised connotations such as cheekiness, high-spiritedness and good humour. If there was any romanticism at the time, it was undermined by a societal understanding of the terrible violence associated with larrikin gangs. The push scene throughout Australia was built on a culture of blood sports, which they were said to have used for recreation, initiation, intimidation, and to earn money. Bare-knuckle fights later became organised bouts where people could gamble, settle scores, and spectate. Australia's boxing history has roots directly back to the push culture of areas just like the Rocks. Larrikin gang member Larry Foley was regarded as the father of Australian boxing due to his participation in countless bare-knuckle boxing matches. It is said that in 1871, Foley fought a rival gang member for 71 rounds until police eventually intervened. A fellow boxer and celebrated associate of the Rocks push, Albert Griffiths, or Young Griffo, would go on to become the world featherweight boxing champion in 1890. Albert Griffith's time in the international boxing rings of the US did not bring about liberation from the harshness of his Australian beginnings. Albert had been taken in as a youngster by several local families from the Rocks following the untimely death of his mother early in his childhood. He spent most of his days and evenings on the streets, fighting and trying to scrape together enough money to survive by delivering papers. Griffiths found comfort in grog and throughout his career was said to have neglected his training and showed up to most bouts intoxicated, depending more on his natural talents than on any hard-earned skill. Despite this, he remained an intimidating and challenging boxing opponent. Griffiths took his career to the US after he was banned from Sydney rings following several incidents where hordes of the Rocks push entered the ring to intimidate Albert's opponents and referees. Despite the intimidation tactics which may have helped to secure his wins in Australia, there was no doubt of his capabilities during his overseas career. A doomed fight on the 27th of April 1898 against Bull McCarthy was proof of Albert's ferociousness in the ring. The fight lasted 20 rounds and was eventually won by Griffiths after he knocked his opponent out. The knockout was achieved by a savage rain of blows to Bull's head, which resulted in a severe concussion. His condition was so grave that he was taken to hospital and he died from his head injuries. Griffiths was initially charged with manslaughter and remanded in custody. However, these charges were eventually dropped. But this would not be the first or last time that Albert Griffiths had a brush with the law. He was arrested on many occasions for petty crimes such as vagrancy and disorderly conduct. Most troubling was the allegation of sexual assault on a young boy in his boxing gym on Coney Island. Newspaper The Evening World published the article "Griffo, a Fugitive" on the 16th of May 1895, explaining the events which occurred following the accusation. Warrant issued on serious charges against the Australian boxer. On complaint of the representative of the Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children, a warrant was issued yesterday morning at Coney Island for the arrest of young Griffo. The charge against him is a very grave one, and should it be proven, the boxer may be required to serve 10 years in a state prison. Griffo fled the city on Monday last, and his present whereabouts are not known. A 9-year-old son of a tailor named Gottlieb is the actual complainant, and except for the interference of Mr. Jerry's agent, it is probable that no charges would have been preferred. The postponed bout between Griffo and Levine, which was to have taken place on the night of May 30th, has been declared off. It has been reported last night that Griffo had sailed for England in a cattle ship. A rumour that he was hiding in Philadelphia prompted 2 of the Society's detectives to leave for the Quaker City last night. After spending some time on the run, Albert was eventually caught. He pled guilty to the charge and served 1 year imprisonment for the crime. Griffiths had such a destructive relationship with alcohol, fighting, and the law that while he was living and working in the US as a boxer, his Australian family helped to have him apprehended and sent to a New York workhouse out of concern for his welfare. He died in 1927, poor and without any children, far from his Australian home. Throughout his life, Griffith's name graced the headlines of numerous publications with eye-catching articles like "Young Griffo Insane," "Pugilist in a Straitjacket," and "Pugilist Runs Amok." However, other headlines showed reverence for his early promising boxing career. "Young Griffo, Marvel of Antipodes, World's Greatest Boxer. Young Griffo, the Australian Marvel." While Albert Griffiths boxed his way around the US, the prominence of gangs throughout Australian towns and cities peaked in the late 1800s, with groups such as Miller's Point Push, Straw Hat Push, 40 Thieves, Gibb Street Mob, and Glebe Push. Gang members were said to have sported tattoos which symbolised their commitment and dedication to the promotion of crime. The Rocks Push continued to patrol streets and lanes like Harrington Place in the early hours of the morning, looking for overindulgent sailors and other unfortunate drunkards. These pubgoers would be lured into dark alleys and hidden corners by the women of the Rocks Push cohort, who frequented the pubs as sex workers or donners as they were colloquially known. The donners hung about in places where, quote, slang and vulgarity were mixed in lavish quantities, where harlots and riffraff, ex-convicts, and the scum of all the oceans collected, unquote. Tales were numerous of incidents where a drunkard was too preoccupied getting acquainted with a donner to notice a pusher sneaking up behind him. The Rocks Push would strategically embed razors in the soles of their shoes, which they would use to incapacitate their unwitting victim by slashing his Achilles heel. After robbing, slashing, and beating a victim, they would roll their bloodied bodies into the nearby Suez Canal to be washed into the harbour. The use of razors was one shared mode of operation for the Rocks Push. Another, more noticeable shared quality was that of their manner of dress. The Push used the proceeds of their crimes to dress strikingly. Their highly distinctive and unique style was described by Banjo Patterson, who outlined the attire and general appearance of the Push as this: wiry, hard-faced little fellows for the most part, with scarcely a sizable man amongst them. They were all clothed in Push evening dress, black bell-bottom pants, no waistcoat, black paget coat, white shirt with no collar, and a gaudy neckerchief round the bare throat. Their boots were marvels, very high in the heel, and picked out with all sorts of colours down the sides. Captured further in the poetry of another Australian writer, Henry Lawson, the bastard from the bush, later renamed the captain of the Push, crudely depicted the attitudes of the Push crowd. A language warning is required for this poem. Would you dong a bloody copper if you caught the cunt alone? Would you stoush a swell or Chinese person, split his garret with a stone? Would you have a mole to keep you? Would you swear off work for good? What? Live on prostitution? My colonial oath I would. To clarify, in this slang-heavy poem, a copper is a police officer, a swell is a gentleman or a wealthy person. A Chinese person was not the term used in the original poem, but rather a derogatory slang reference to people from China was used, and a mole is a woman with loose morals. Push or gang culture was not just limited to the Sydney area. An article in The Advertiser from Adelaide in 1901, titled The Hooligan in Australia, reads, speaking of a Mr. Ambrose Pratt and his prolific writing about push culture. His personal experience with push larrikinism was confined to the city of Sydney, but its notorious Sydney push methods are employed in other Australian capitals. Going on, the article describes the pervasiveness of violence in Sydney and the complexities which prevent any real impact of push culture from being truly realised. Mr. Pratt has no hesitation in asserting that the Sydney pushers between them commit 5 to 6 murders yearly, but of necessity, lists of the murdered are not procurable. For one reason, the majority of the victims are poor and friendless, and their disappearance excites little or no attention. For another, the floating population of Australian cities is large, and it would be difficult to distinguish between those who perish at the hands of the pushers and those who drift from place to place unknown and unremarkable. Finally, the article gives some more context for what distinguishes a deadbeat or a loafer from a more highly ranked push member. The latter does not drink very often, he does not smoke nor use tobacco in any other form, but as a master of profanity and a determined, merciless taker of vengeance, he is almost without a rival. The journalist being referenced in the previous article, Ambrose Pratt, made many claims about his associations with the push, which he described as a secretive, selective, and highly organised crime syndicate. He alleged the Rocks push initiated him into their group after he represented them in court on several occasions. He alluded to clandestine political backroom deals and the murder of officials or police who stood in the way of the push or their agenda. While Ambrose had a stellar reputation as a credible journalist, his push claims were lambasted by fellow journalists, and speculation was that Ambrose had made these tales up to help promote fictional work he was soon set to release. The Sydney Morning Herald responded to Ambrose's claims of organised crime with the following sarcastic retort. Not since the world was enlightened to the flying habits of the wombat has so much information of the fancy kind been unloaded on a startled world. Despite Ambrose's claims failing to hold water, the menacing reputation of the Rocks push continued to prevail. By all accounts, the Rocks push vindictiveness was never better exemplified than in the Millers Point murder of Thomas Pert. Thomas was a sailor who lived in the Rocks with his brother and his brother's family. He had made a mark for himself following his alleged role in the arrest of several members of the push. The account of a young boy who witnessed the violence was reported in an article from the Evening News on Thursday the 29th of June 1893. Witness saw the deceased there with Dewan, the accused instigator, and heard the latter say to Pert, "You were funny last night hitting me, wasn't you?" Pert said, "Go away, I do not want to have anything to do with you." Dewan said he wouldn't, and added, "Well, I do. I want to have a fair dinkum fight with you," at the same time taking off his coat. A man named Kyler tried to persuade Dewan to put his coat on again, but he would not do so, and was saying he wanted to fight him. Witness then saw Dewan rush at the deceased and strike him. Deceased struck him in return when Dewan picked up a stone and raised it, but Pert rushed at Dewan and knocked him over. Some of the push came up and rushed the deceased, who, seeing them, commenced to run home. He saw Rich, one of the accused, catch the deceased around the waist as he was running and throw him. This was on the roadway at the brow of the hill which slopes near where the deceased lived. He did not fall heavily, he fell on his back. Rich fell upon him, and then there were several around him. Deceased tried to get up, but had no chance because they were all kicking him while lying on the ground. Witness saw Reed come up and kick Pert on the head. Deceased appeared to become unconscious after he was kicked. Witness saw him make several attempts to get up, but he fell each time, saw him clutch at a post near his door and try to hold himself up. Deceased's brother and several other men lifted him up and carried him into the house. Witness went into the house a couple of minutes later and saw Pert lying on the bed, quite dead. An article from the Bathurst Free Press and Mining Journal from the 28th of June 1893 describes the result of the autopsy. A small bone at the top of the spine was found to be fractured, and it is believed that when the poor fellow was tripped by one of the men, when they all chased him, he fell on his head, causing the fracture of the bone, and then bursting the small arteries in his lungs, bringing about suffocation. At the time of the article, 9 men had been arrested in relation to the murder of Pert. However, only 2 men were ultimately charged with his violent death. They received sentences of less than 10 years apiece. 7 other participants in the beatings were released without charge. Despite the apparent lack of consequences for this act of mob violence, the ramifications would be far-reaching for push culture in the long term, and attitudes towards the push set were souring politically. The incident sparked several political campaigns to end push violence and set into motion attitudes and policies that would help dispel the eventual demise of the Rocks Push and other gangs around Australia. Policing powers were increased, humiliating public punishments were enacted, and the courts were empowered to impose increasingly severe sentences. An article in 1896 shows the shift in the media's narrative, with depictions of a revered and sophisticated mob-style gang giving way to the following. Whence comes the larrikin, the pest of these so-called over-educated colonies? The young loafer of 16 to 8 and 20. Who does not know him, with his weedy, contracted figure, his dissipated, pimply face, his too small jacket, his tight-cut trousers, his high-heeled boots, his arms with outturned elbows swinging across his stomach as he hurries along to join his push, as he calls the pack in which he hunts the solitary citizen. Moral panic had descended upon areas like the Rocks, which were made up of the most underprivileged and marginalised of the Australian population. The push subculture of Victorian and Edwardian Australia was a reaction to a surging population, disparity of wealth, poor housing conditions, and minimal work opportunities. The Rocks Push origins were described herein. Men, women, and children, forced through circumstance to sleep, to wash, to eat in the same room, whose only opportunity of obtaining fresh air is in the lane or street, will sooner or later realise that they are part of a system which has produced these conditions. While the press went to great lengths to terrify readers with tales of strong, brash, and well-organised groups of men working in clandestine and violent ways to secure financial and political success, it is hard to find evidence to substantiate this. There is no doubt that the challenges of life in the Rocks bore a reaction from some of its tenets of violence and crime. However, any real notion of an organised and sophisticated syndicate appears to be the stuff of legend and propaganda. When the terrible tales of women kidnapped and abused in brothels and opium dens were investigated, they were determined to be baseless by law enforcement. And when Ambrose Pratt's stories of organised and sophisticated crime were vetted, Pratt was forced to admit that that too was the stuff of fiction. In reality, gaining membership to a push was not a formal affair. If you were working class, young, and living in a poor area, you were likely regarded as having membership to the local push by onlookers and social commentators. Social class and youth were the defining factors for the subculture, as they continue to be for many subcultures which prevail today. In the end, the true demise of the Rocks Push would occur through tragic circumstances, which were exploited by a government eager to use the misfortunes of the poor to their advantage. As the bubonic plague swept through cities in Australia, the overcrowded, poorly sanitised and filthy streets of the Rocks became a breeding ground for illness and death. In fact, the Rocks was the site of the first case of the bubonic plague in Australia. Diseased rats infested the Rocks with the Black Death as they scampered off cargo ships whose origins were overseas ports deep in the grips of the pandemic. In 1901, following the death of over 100 people, areas such as the Rocks were cordoned off and the cleansing operation began. During this time, many of the ramshackle dwellings were demolished and the government used the opportunity to begin reconstructing its waterfronts. The government employed the poor to demolish the area, which included the dismantling of their own homes, lives and establishments. This dismantling of their homes led to the fading of the Rocks push into Australian mythology. By the 1920s, journalists had turned pimply-faced and wiry larrikins into strong men who adhered to secret moral codes and who revolted against their oppressors. An article in the Sunday Times from the 21st of August 1921 looked back on the glory days of the true pushers who once ruled the streets of Sydney. In those days, when the pushers were in a situation in the city, they were made up of men, big, strong, men's-sized men of muscle and physique. Today, the insignificant pushers are mere cigarette-smoking larrikins with hollow chests and thin legs, youths with less fight in them than a worm, but with any amount of activity when they are in force and meet a little man with a few shillings in his pocket. In the old days, the push went to meet the police. Today, they would run a mile to dodge them. They have degenerated. Australians continue to measure the youth of each generation against their forefathers, never giving the former a chance to triumph over the fictitiously glorified characters of our past. At the same time, we both admonish and celebrate our criminal beginnings, a complex that we continue to reckon with today. Thank you for listening to this episode of Australian Psyche. For more information about this show, please find us on Instagram at Australian Psyche Podcast, Facebook at Australian Psyche, Twitter or X at Oz Psyche Pod, and YouTube at Australian Psyche. You can follow the podcast to be notified of next week's episode, The Glover Family, where we discuss the tragic events that shook the small Tasmanian town of Triabunna in 1898. This has been an Antipodes FM production.